putting yourselves in positions where you're cross-cultural, cross-linguistic. I love what G.K. Chesterton says. He says, living overseas is not so much that you don't find things that are familiar. It's just that you find things that are familiar, but they're all in the wrong place. And that's the story of those people who go overseas and serve, and you feel like an outlier, and you feel out of place and out of, disconnected maybe with the culture, or certainly with the culture you left back home. Remember the big story. Get a word for this season right now, and be like William Carey. Plod. Trudge through those difficult times. Don't be afraid to get muddy and dirty and messy. This is the messy middle on the outskirts of heaven, but we're headed to a better kingdom, a more glorious world.
And then just the dryness sometimes of obedience. I hate to say it that way, but it is sometimes. I mean, with compassion, you feel something. With God's glory, you imagine something. And with obedience, that's that plotting that can lead to a stirring up of compassion.
When you see a breakthrough, it's like tasting that spoon of mom's cooking, her stew before dinner. It's not dinner, but it's that foretaste of what it's going to be like in heaven.
Welcome to this episode of the Modern Day Missionaries podcast. Today we're sitting down with David Joannes. He is the founder and CEO of Within Reach Global and has served as a missionary for more than 25 years. He's also a missiologist and the author of several books, including The Mind of a Missionary and Gospel Privilege, and he hosts the Missions Pulse podcast. Today, he and his family live in Chiang Mai, Thailand, where he leads a team of missionaries committed to reaching the spiritually forgotten. And I loved today's interview. I'm excited for you to hear it because we dig into David's book, The Mind of a Missionary, and really look at what makes us tick. How do missionaries think differently? What are some of the things that motivate us, drive us? Some of the expectations that we have before and while we're on the field? What are some of the sacrifices we make? And what are the rewards that we reap? So for missionaries, I think you're going to really feel identified with a lot of things that David shares and gain some insight into how you tick. And for people who are interested in learning more about missionaries or who serve missionaries, you're also going to glean some great insight from today's episode. So with that, let's dive into today's episode with David Joannes. Hey, David, thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast.
I am so honored to be here with you and really excited about this conversation. Thank you for having me.
So am I. I've heard about you for years. Finally read The Mind of a Missionary, which has been on my reading list for such a long time. And now I'm kicking myself that I did not read it beforehand. So I am really excited to talk about that today and to dig into some of the topics that you delve into in there. And, what comes to mind off the top of my head is just, you say the mind of a missionary. And I love that because it's not like the mind of a human or the mind of any kind of a person. It's the mind of a missionary, recognizing that we have unique minds. We are different. We are not like other people. We're human. I don't want to put us on a pedestal, but we're a different kind of people. I know you and I were just saying, and I'd love for you to share what are some of the things that you've seen. How have you noticed that we are different from everybody else?
I mean, yes, you're right. Not to put anyone on a pedestal. And missionaries, God only uses broken people because that's the only kind of people there are. I don't know if you've noticed that, but I've certainly recognized that about my life. But The Mind of a Missionary, I mean, this whole book is exploring the motivations, the expectations, the sacrifices and rewards. Why in the world did I move to China, buy a one-way plane ticket when I was 18 years old, smuggle Bibles into China, get interrogated by the police? I mean, I didn't know these things were going to happen. And putting yourselves in positions where you're cross-cultural, cross-linguistic, and just, I love what G.K. Chesterton says. He says, living overseas is not so much that you don't find things that are familiar. It's just that you find things that are familiar, but they're all in the wrong place. And that's the story of those people who go overseas and serve, and you feel like an outlier and you feel out of place and out of, disconnected maybe with the culture, or certainly with the culture you left back home. And so this whole idea behind the book was exploring what are those motivations, expectations, the sacrifices, the rewards. And there's all different kinds of missionaries, right? I mean, people who are extroverted, people who are introverted, people are in the limelight, people not so much. And but the whole thing is God's got this narrative. He's been telling it for millennium. He's weaving a tapestry throughout history, and how in the world he loves to include us in this grand story. So that's the exciting part about gaining the mind of a missionary, which essentially is the mind of Christ.
Yeah. And what are some of the things that you've noticed that set us apart or make us unique? Obviously, we're all a little crazy because for to move to the other side of the world, to support Raise, the things that we do, like you were just talking about what you did, they're wild.
Yeah.
So other than having that, I don't want to say ability, but that capacity to take risk, and it's a capacity only given by the Lord. What would be some other themes that you see that maybe make us unique?
Hmm. Part of the book, I remember I interviewed, I don't know, 120 different missionaries from all over the world. So I got this big picture view of a lot of different types of people. What's crazy is one of the things that stood out from all the stories, from all the different styles of missionary work and different nuances, is the strong belief uh, makeup. If you ever take the Strengths Finders test, Clifton's
Yeah.
Strengths Finder, missionaries always score high on belief. Yes, it's going to be tough. Yes, you're going to face some different things, but that belief system is there. But we often can be, the allure of the exotic initially draws us. Oh, the Thailand, where I'm, recording from right now, Thailand, the temples, the people. And so you have this allure of the exotic and distant. But then one of the unique things about missionaries is the longer you're in a place, the more you grow into that culture. And now you have to say, well, is this really what I want to do for an extended period of time? Because missionary attrition takes place a year and a half, 2 years in your first term. People are thinking, this is more difficult than I thought. So that belief system, that belief part of our mindset, based on God's calling, based on His overarching passion and His glory, I think that's what really sets people apart. We're not more special. We're not the elite forces of the church, but God's looking for a yes, and He's looking for someone to go to those places that are hard to get to. And cross culturally, cross linguistically, I mean, when you have to study Mandarin Chinese, not everybody wants to do that. Not everybody wants to leave their hometown. And so that's what I did for 4 years, spent 15 years in China, now 11 here in Thailand. And so I find that belief system really one of the main driving points and motivations of that initial call to the mission field.
And I love that you pointed that out because if you look at any subsect of people in a profession, if you look at medical professionals, if you look at firefighters, if you look at lawyers, you're going to find some commonalities in people who
Mm.
choose a particular profession or calling or way of life. And I think it's helpful for us as missionaries to recognize, okay, these are some things that make us different, not necessarily better than anybody else, but that make us unique and different. And I know we have listeners who are missionaries. We also have listeners who serve missionaries or people who are thinking about going on the field. And so you touched on belief there. That kind of fits in your category there of motivations. I'd
Yeah.
love for you to break that down. You mentioned motivations, expectations, sacrifices, rewards. What are some of those motivations that get us to the field? And then for our missionaries who are listening, who are currently on the field, how do those keep them on the
Yeah.
field?
This is a tricky one because we have things externally and extrinsically and intrinsically that motivate us, right? Things that from the outside push us toward a particular goal, a carrot on a stick or a reward for something that you do is a motivator, right? Then there's intrinsic or internal inherent kind of desires and dreams that God puts in your heart that you don't need someone pushing you towards this particular goal. It's God given. It's that Psalm 37:4. Delight yourself in the Lord. He'll give you the desires of your heart because your desires mirror His in many ways. The mind of a missionary, it basically, every chapter, all 12 chapters, has one missionary guide. I highlight, Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, C.T. Studd, Nicholas Zinzendorf, David Eubank, Hudson Taylor, and others. And the first three chapters under the section of motivations are something that I've spent so much time saying, Lord, what really motivated me? And I think one of the first ones is compassion for the lost. You hear that missionary come from afar. You haven't yet gone to the field, and they're telling you stories of these people in Ecuador and this missionary story of Jim and Elizabeth Elliot. Jim's killed by the Auca Indians in 1956, and you're like, wow, my heart is compassionate. You start to mirror God's compassion for people. However, 1 year in, 2 years in, you get to know the people you were initially drawn to. You're linked to them. You're past the honeymoon stage, and now you're like quoting Spurgeon: "If I were God and the world treated me as it treated him, I would kick that wretched thing to pieces." And you're like, it doesn't have staying power. So compassion for the lost, married with obedience to the commands of Christ, and then God's glory at the center of all things. I think that three strand combination builds a strong motivation for what is next to come. And those are going to be the expectations inside of you, of your church, of the local culture, and the story goes on. But finding the heart of God, knowing his big dream of Revelation 7:9, all people standing before his throne. That's what we want to see. His name, because he deserves honor from every tribe and people and language and tongue and ethno-linguistic group. And so what motivates us? Is it, no guts, no glory, no newsletter story, or is there something deeper in us that's looking for God's glory, his honor to be known among the nations?
Yeah. And how do you stir up some of those motivations when life begins to get dry and flat? I mean, we go strong, but and especially we don't see rewards. I know we'll talk about that a little bit later. You have that section on rewards, but there is often a period of time or many periods of times when we're not seeing rewards or
Yeah.
connecting with them or aware of them. And when our motivation's low and we're not feeling a lot of those rewards, how can a missionary stir themselves up to keep going?
Yeah. Yeah, because you went not just for yourself, you went for God's glory, and you carry these promises. He gave you promises along the way. And so you're expecting some breakthrough. You've read Don Richardson's Peace Child. You've read Bruchko. You've read, Hudson Taylor's Spiritual Secret. You got all these stories of amazing missionary heroes, and they saw some sort of breakthrough. And then you don't see that breakthrough, or
Yeah.
you don't put yourself in a position to, see God work, or maybe you do. There's some of these people who spent 30 years on the field and had one convert, and it was decades, maybe centuries later that they saw rewards. To me, one of the great ways for a pick me up to a weary missionary is reading those missionary biographies. I mean,
Mm.
you want something that will really inspire you when you're down. Read Mountain Rain by James O. Frazier, or about James O. Frazier. Read these stories of 7-month pregnant Maria Taylor, Hudson Taylor's wife, who's jumping from the second story of a building trying to escape the rioters in Changsha, China. And so you see that you're not alone. God is doing something, and it's going to be difficult, and you're going to run into hiccups. But there's these divine intersections along the way. They're valleys, they're mountains. And God is able to do wonderful things. Read missionary biographies when you're in a slump, because you'll realize there's more to this story, and the next chapter is just over the horizon. I think that's a great way to kind of gear your mindset towards the ultimate or overarching picture that God's got going on.
That is a great recommendation because I think if we're only reading the Instagram stories of everybody around us, then we're seeing kind of the glossed over pretty things and exciting things that it looks like it's happening. But it is really easy to forget the years and years and years that other people have invested where they saw nothing. We see people in their glory days. I mean, I think about even our pastor when we served in Peru and all of the years that he took of being faithful until, the church was like this for a long time. And then you start to take off. But that's when everybody starts to pay attention. I mean, has there been a moment like that for you, David, with you and your family, where you guys just felt low in motivation, or like, how do we keep going? Is this worth it? Either when you were in China or while you've been in Thailand?
Honestly, no. I've had such a perfect experience over the last 26 years.
Oh my
I've never
gosh,
felt
amazing.
depressed or down. Yeah, right. Um, Certainly. I mean, there are, I spent 15 years in China going to conflict areas, human trafficking, methamphetamine production areas, unreached people groups on the borders of Burma, Thailand, China, Laos, Vietnam. I've been interrogated 22 times, yelling, screaming from Chinese police because we're sharing the gospel in this area, and it got really messy. I remember there was one time, it was May 5th, 2005. I'm sorry, 2015. I'd been in China for, I don't know, 14 years by this point. And we had been working among the Yao people group, YAO, an unreached people group, for years and years. Saw a little breakthrough here and there. I wasn't sure if it would last. We saw disciples, we baptized people, but we're really trying to make a big impact. And so I ended up leading this team from California back to the area that we've been working in for 12, 13 years. And they took us from village to village to village that I had, years earlier been jumping into the ditch on the side of the road as police cars are zooming across trying to find us. And you can see the difficulty of our situation. And our local missionaries, who we'd partnered with for years, raised them up, took us from village to village, 12 different villages, where there was all these underground churches that had been planted throughout the years. I didn't realize they existed. And some of these people are meeting by candlelight at midnight to escape the watching eyes of the government. Some people had these walls in their homes with all the holes in their plaster, and I'm thinking, why is their home so destroyed? Well, they're the holes from removing all the idols that they had seen, that they had been worshiping previously. Removed them, broke them down, burned them. So we saw this great turning to the Lord. I was so moved. We took a 75-kilometer drive down into the city in the edge of Vietnam and in China. And as soon as we arrived into the city, 6 police cars surrounded us, bullhorns, captured us, took us to the police station, all our local missionaries. We were interrogated until about 3 in the morning. And
Wow.
some of our local missionaries were beat up. It was one of the darkest, hardest times of our lives. The team got out. People were jailed, but then released soon after. And I remember going home to my wife thinking, what have I could be doing something else with the skill sets God gave me, with the things that He, put inside me. Why am I putting myself through this? And we wanted to leave. We didn't like China anymore. We wanted to do something different, and yet, so we took a little sabbatical, went to the Philippines. In that distance, though, God was doing something in the background. And through that persecution, through the struggle, we saw an even greater wave of revival among the previously unreached Yao people. And now it's not an unreached people group anymore, according to
Mm.
joshuaproject.net. So at that time, I'm in that valley, I'm in that dark place, struggle. And if only I could see these divine intersections. I couldn't see them, right? I didn't know what would take place in this moment of dismal experience, but God always is working in the background to tell and paint His overarching narrative. And so,
Yeah.
yes, there's often times when I feel overwhelmed. I need to remind myself that God has got it. We will see the culmination of human history in Revelation 7:9, regardless if we get caught by the police or we're having a bad day. He will be glorified among all these tribes. If only I could not be so dense and remind myself of God's goodness and promises.
Thinking about your story right there, I'm struck just by thinking of compassion, obedience, God's glory. I love that you stirred yourself up with God's glory, that
Hmm.
thinking ahead, that imagining what God will do, and then just the dryness sometimes of obedience. I hate to say it that way, but it is sometimes. I
Oh,
mean, with
absolutely.
compassion you feel something, with God's glory you imagine something, and with obedience, that's that plotting. That's
Yeah.
just like, I'm going to do it because it's what you've asked me to do. I mean, I think of my own story, and there were so many times where I maybe couldn't really tap into the glory piece that much. It was hard to visualize what he might do, and I didn't feel compassion,
Hmm.
but I was like, bless the Lord, oh my soul, you sent me here and I will do this. And just that act of obedience can lead to that, a stirring up of compassion. It can awaken your heart to be able to imagine what God can do. So all three of those I think are so important because they touch on a different thing and they all work together and play into it. You also just were talking about kind of that the suffering and the difficulty of those intense seasons. And I'm thinking about the times that it's really, really hard because it's so intense, because we're running out of money, because we're being interrogated, because, I mean, for us, every pipe in our house had exploded and the city ran out of water. I mean, there's those desperate times. And then there's just the really dry times where it's not like you're in danger, but you're dry and you're like, is anything even happening? My day is mundane. I feel like a robot. No one's reacting or responding. And kind of thinking about those almost ties into your next one with the expectations, because you talk about those dark seasons and you talk about the story of Mother Teresa. I'd love for you to touch on that a little bit and weave that in. What does that look like?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we have different kinds of expectations, right? We have expectations of ourselves. We want to be able to accomplish something for all our time spent on the field and language learning and trying to get into the culture. I remember my first class in Chinese. I'm learning how to say ma means mother, ma, hemp, ma, horse, ma, to scold. And then a silent tone, ma, is a question. So you could say, mama, ma, mama, did mother scold the horse? And so you're like learning language and it's difficult. And
Wow.
this has been the story of so many people. You have William Carey, the father of modern missions, who said, I can plod. I can pursue in any definite pursuit. To this, I owe everything. You have Nick Ripken and Ruth Ripken losing their son on the mission field. You have Hudson Taylor darting his head out of the way as a cannonball zips past his face. And the stories, this is why you need to bathe yourself in the stories, bathe yourself in the word, but
Mm-hmm.
supplement it with missionary biographies, because this is yours. If you're a missionary, if you're an aspiring missionary, if you're a missions pastor, if you're a pastor, if you're a congregant back home and you're thinking, what is this story? Get to know what these expectations are going to entail. You have internal, you have external. What does your church want you to do? They want to see numbers. I hate to say it, it sounds ugly, but they want an ROI. They're supporting you
They do.
financially. What are those dollars going toward? Is it advancing the kingdom of God? And so, as you touch on these things, I use the ideas of Robert Moffat, who had this internal voice inside of his head, constantly plaguing him. You're not enough. Don Richardson hears these voices in, you know, Papua and New Guinea as he's trying to reach the Sawi people. And so, external, internal, how do you juggle all these things? You stop, you pause, you go back to that original call and realize that the voice of God is greater than the vox populi, the voice of the people, and they don't have the final say. Even those internal thoughts might be negative. It's an internal negative loop, right, going on in your head. And when I read this
Yeah.
book, I mean, I'm exploring ideas about neuroscience and psychology and what makes people do what they're doing. The missionary journey is no joke. It will test the strongest of us. And if we can continually take our eyes off our situations, ourselves, and to the bigger picture of what God's doing. I mean, I wish I had time to tell you all these things. A missionary was down, they're depressed, they're feeling like they're not making a difference, and then something clicks in the heavenlies. Maybe they don't even see it. Harold Schofield didn't see it, who died in China, but his prayers led to the Cambridge Seven moving to China and the changing of the world through those men. So if you're feeling down, dismal, in the dumps, stressed, take a pause, step back, don't throw in the towel and become another number in the missionary attrition. Rather, focus your eyes on what God's going to do and will do. And I think you've got a greater story over the horizon.
Yeah. And I appreciate, getting to read some of those stories, like you said, and the fact that they journaled some of their thoughts and feelings, because we can look back and just see their heroic actions and not know what was going on in their minds. I mean, I think with Mother Teresa, I believe that it was letters she wrote to her spiritual director.
That's
And
right.
from what I remember reading in another place, I don't think, I think she had asked very specifically that they never be made public.
That's
And
right.
then they were made public. And so there is some controversy like, oh, gosh, should that have been made public because she didn't want them to? And yet, I have to say, I'm kind of grateful, because you look at somebody like that and you can feel like, they're just saintly all the time
That's right.
in their interior world. And to hear that they went through the dark night of the soul, I mean, she went through it for years and years and years. And it's sad, but it's also encouraging, I think, for those of us who have been in those places. I mean, the fact that she kept going is wild. It's just wild to me. So, okay, then going on into sacrifices. I mean, you could say that's even a sacrifice of all the internal stuff that comes against us, because the enemy is going to come after us for sure. But outline the three types of suffering that you discuss in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Those dark nights of the soul, I mean, almost every missionary guide in the mind of a missionary is no superhero in real life. They just were on
No.
a long slog and they trusted God. And it's probably where a lot of people are too. Because we don't know the end of the story like we know Mother Teresa's and Jim Elliot's and Elizabeth Elliot, right? You don't know the end yet. You don't know the Peace
Yeah.
Child story from Don Richardson in 1976. So what I've encountered about sacrifices, it's almost like I don't even need to say this really, Stephanie, because if you're a missionary, you know the sacrifices you're making. But in the book, I highlight three different kinds because I've seen this as a theme that's happened. And those are physical challenges. I'm highlighting Nick and Ruth Ripken. Their son Timothy dies of an asthma attack in Nairobi, and they want to go home. They don't know if they can make it. And so these physical challenges are real. Uh, so many people have lost. I mean, the stories of missionaries crossing the Atlantic, having a child die on the ship, burying that child by tossing them over the ship into the Atlantic. I don't know how they were able to go on. I have
That
two
was the
daughters.
Moffats, right?
That's right. Yeah. They're burying little Jamie, who's 6 years old, who died on the way from South Africa to England. And I mean, I have two girls. I cannot imagine losing Kara or Eliana and not even giving them a proper burial. Rather, pushing them off into the Atlantic Ocean. Physical challenges are real, whether it's personal or, vicarious trauma you're going to experience. That's one of the challenges. Emotional struggles. You look at William Carey. Well, Dorothy had a mental breakdown early on in her experience. It was the polar opposite experience of William Carey, the father of modern missions. She was the would be mother of modern missions. But instead, she went to a very dark place mentally, and it was these emotional struggles. How do we deal with them? And then the spiritual adversities or spiritual hurdles. And obviously, Hudson and Maria Taylor topped the charts on those because the constant spiritual attacks. Be prepared. Don't think this is smooth sailing and butterflies and rainbows. That is not the mission field. Amy Carmichael was once, Amy Carmichael was once asked by a young woman who wanted to join her overseas, what is the mission field like? This was around 1911, I think. What is the missionary life like? And her famous quote, made popular by Elizabeth Elliot, she said, missionary life is a chance to die. And that is a striking statement. But then you have other missionaries like James Calvert, who's like, I want to go reach these cannibal peoples. And the ship's captain says, no, you're going to die if you go to those cannibals on the island. And he said, we died long before we arrived here. And I
It's
think this is
powerful.
what Jesus is talking about, dying to self so that his life might live in and through you. And when you face those challenges and difficulties, um, it is not going to be easy. You are going to want to throw in the towel. You're not going to want to keep serving the people who you initially loved and had compassion for. Remember, that initial motivation. It was compassion. But then the people are driving you nuts. And then they do something harmful to you or your family or whatever the story is. Those challenges
Hmm.
are going to really test. Are you going to be able to see the rewards, the fruit of all your labors? Maybe you won't. Not everybody's story is the same. But we need to be faithful to follow in the footsteps of our master, regardless of where he goes. And that's not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with those sufferings too, you mentioned at the very beginning of the interview, missionaries are so different too. We're so similar and yet we're so different. And I think of all the different places God calls us to. I mean, I know here at Modern Day, we've got missionaries serving in the 1040 window where everything about their life is shrouded in secrecy because it has to be. And we have missionaries serving in the US who have committed their lives and days to prayer. So they're going to face different kinds of suffering. And so in all of this too, it's so important to be encouraged by these other stories and yet also not compare ourselves to these other stories. I know for me, I served in an urban setting. And so there was a lot that we went through. I did not face daily threats of death or interrogation. So that wasn't a part of my story, but we were surrounded by poverty and people in need and disasters in the city and urban setting. Things would set on fire, and it was different things that would come our way, or anybody in ministry, betrayal. I mean, all the stuff that you go through, we all go through different things. And so it's saying, Lord, how can I be inspired by the suffering of
Mm.
somebody else and yet not compare myself? And how can I receive your grace in the specific challenges that I'm going through today? So, and so now we've talked about motivations, which I think is pretty fun for the most part. We've talked about expectations, which is really grounding. We've talked about sufferings, which is really tough. And David, now there's rewards. Talk to us about rewards.
That's what we're all looking for, right? Not rewards for ourselves, but we want to see that the mission life matters and it changes things and it shifts cultures, right? God's telling this story. I want to be a small part of the big story. And so when you see a breakthrough, it's like tasting that spoon of mom's cooking, her stew before dinner. It's not dinner, but it's that foretaste of what it's going to be like in heaven. And so the rewards I think that we experience on the mission field highlight Amy Carmichael's life, joy. This woman, she had the most incredible story. Do you mind if I just tell a little portion of Amy Carmichael?
Please do. I love her story.
Most people don't know that. They know that Prina came in 1906, and then she began this rescue work of rescuing trafficked children all throughout southern India. But when she was 3 years old, I think it was 1876, 3 year old Amy Carmichael had a dream. She was born with brown eyes and she wanted blue eyes like her mother. So she smoothed the bed where she was sleeping and she invited God the Father to come and speak with her. And she prayed because her mom told her that God always answers our prayers. She said, I want blue eyes. And she went to bed so excited. The next morning, she describes this story in the ninth chapter of The Mind of a Missionary, or 10th. I tell this story. She wakes up, runs to the mirror, and is looking for her new blue eyes that answer to her prayer because mom said God always answers prayers. And she looks in the mirror and sees mere brown eyes. And she cried and cried, and blue was her favorite color for the rest of her life. She got over that initial sadness of not having her brown eyes turned blue, but she always loved blue. All her books were bound in blue leather. She wore blue dresses. She described, if you search Amy Carmichael's books for the word blue, you will see it thousands of times. The blue sky, the blue sea, the blue petals. It's amazing. And there was one time right around 1906 when she hears about this underground trafficking of children. She can't sneak into the Hindu temples because she's Irish. She's very pale skinned. So she has this crazy plan. She starts putting coffee powder all over her arms, on her face. She wears an Indian sari, and she shows her Indian friends right before she's about to sneak into these temples to rescue the children who are being trafficked in the Hindu temples. And they laugh and they said, Amy, you look just like an Indian. It's a good thing you don't have blue eyes like the other missionaries because you would never be able to rescue the children. And suddenly, God's answer, no, to her problems um, of not having blue eyes strikes her. She begins weeping and realized God's no, God's silence. Sometimes it's not a yes, but he always knows what he's doing. And so joy permeated her story. I think it's one of the great rewards. That was a long-winded answer to your question about rewards, but
I
joy
loved it.
joy is one of them. Breakthrough, again, it's a foretaste of what we'll see God's kingdom come in our earthly setting, like it's always accomplished in heaven. And then finally, I highlight Heidi Baker, the kingdom of God on the earth. And these are the rewards we want to be looking for, and we're hoping for, and praying for. And I pray that people who are watching will experience those things.
Yeah. What a great note to wrap up the book on. I'd love to just ask for words of encouragement for two sectors of people, two groups of people. One would be our missionaries, and one would be those who serve missionaries, because I know we have both who are listening in. What would be a word of encouragement that you would love to leave our missionary listeners with, David?
We've all been through difficult times, right? If you're on the field, it is no simple walk. Nicholas Zinzendorf described it as the road laced with thorns and woe. What a way of describing the missionary life. Amy Carmichael said it's a chance to die. Nicholas Zinzendorf said it's a road laced with thorns and woe. I would encourage you, there's going to be ups, there's going to be downs, but look, the overarching story that God is penning, it's difficult to see these divine intersections. It's difficult to see what he's doing in those seasons. But I would encourage you to press on, to find a word for this season. God's got a specific thing he wants to speak to you. Hold on to his promises that he initially gave you, and look at don't just get stuck in the messy middle. Read Revelation 7. Revelation 7 9. It's the culmination of human history. It will be accomplished. All the peoples gathered around the throne. What you're doing right now is part of this narrative. Don't forget it. Okay? It's not easy, but don't forget you are a small part of the big story that God's telling. So I think we just need a readjustment of our mental faculties. And really, essentially, the mind of a missionary, it's awkward and strange and difficult. But essentially, I say it's the mind of Christ because the spirit of Christ is the spirit of missions. The closer you get to him, the more missionary you become. So you're a missionary. You're involved in missions. Look unto him, remember the big story, get a word for this season right now, and be like William Carey. Plod. Go through trudge through those difficult times. Don't be afraid to get muddy and dirty and messy. This is the messy middle on the outskirts of heaven, but we're headed to a better kingdom, a more glorious world. So I pray that encourages you today.
Yes, amen to that. And how about for those of our listeners who serve missionaries, what is something you would love to say to them? What is
Mm.
something you wish that they knew?
Yeah. You know, people on the field are dealing with many different things, and you, as either a member care person or someone, you know, who's in their home country that they've left, you cannot overestimate how powerful your small words of encouragement are. They have a tendency, missionaries have a tendency to respond to your short message. Hey, how are you? Oh, we're doing great. We're seeing breakthrough, and trying to paint this picture that things are all good, because missionaries rely on financial support. You don't want to ruffle feathers, and you're hoping that paycheck still keeps coming in. So try to press past those initial encounters and say, okay, that's all wonderful, and we celebrate with you those breakthroughs. But how's your family? How's your wife? You guys need you ever think about doing counseling, and maybe you could do something that would fun for your family? How are your daughters and your sons? And kind of ask them some more personal questions, because this is so meaningful for people who often feel like they are out of sight and out of mind. Uh, to know that they are remembered, to know that you are that rope holder, like William Carey said, I will
Mhm.
go down into the depths of the gold mine to dig for souls, but you must hold the ropes. Well, you're the rope holder. Show them that in those dark times, when they're scrounging around looking for gems, they feel a tug on the lip of the edge of that chasmal deep pit, and you're there, and you care, and you want to know that they're healthy mentally, emotionally, spiritually. I think these kinds of words of encouragement are going to be quite powerful, a great touch point, and let people know that it's not just about the work. God chooses and uses broken people because there's no other kind of person. And he's in the process of repairing and restoring all of us. And so we're all in the same boat, if you're a missionary or you're back home. So those kind of getting more intimate and personal with those people, I think is going to be very meaningful in their lives.
You're right. And like you said, we're all in this together. It takes us all to
That's
do
right.
this. So I'm so grateful for this book. As I told you again before we started, it's a really well written book. And I
Thank
don't
you.
just say that because I'm interviewing David. For everyone who's listening, pick up The Mind of the Missionary, because it's filled with stories and then points around those, as David went through today. It fleshes out so much more than what we got a chance to talk about. And I wish I could make this required reading for everybody who was going to go on the field or who is on the field. Although required is not a fun word. So inspired reading, I don't know, some
Sure.
other word. All I'm saying is pick it up and read it, because it will encourage you. And I something that's really standing out to me today about what you talked about is reading more missionary biographies. And I would agree. I would say I've never not read one and felt read one and not felt inspired afterwards, and given me a just some fresh wind in my sails, I guess.
That's
So
right.
David, how can people connect with you? Because this is not the only book that you've written. You've written others. What would be some ways people can connect with you and find out more?
Yeah. Well, my personal website is davidjoannes.com. You'll see it in the description of this video. Or maybe you're listening, just check out the description, davidjoannes.com. Our ministry is withinreachglobal.org. Find out what we're doing to reach unreached people groups in the 1040 window. Books are all over Amazon or wherever you search for books, and so they're pretty easy to find. And then I'm on social media like a crazy person, because I have to be. So yeah, definitely connect with me on Instagram, connect with me or different places. I love to see missionary voices rising up, because God's doing something unique in so many people that your story matters. So yeah, I'd love to get in touch. Visit our websites or check out Amazon for all those different kinds of books and titles.
Yes, and we will post links to all of the things that you mentioned today, David, as well. And like you just said, I love what you said. I'm all over social media because we need to hear stories. And you're right. We need to hear the stories, not just of missionaries from the past, but we need to hear their stories of people today. So missionaries who are sharing your story, be real in how you share your stories. Share the highs, share the lows, share all of it because we need to hear what's going on in your life as well. So David, thank you for sharing some of your life with us, some of what you've learned. And we just really appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you. I feel like a modern day missionary right now.
You
Love the title.
are. I
Love
like
the
it.
title of this podcast. This is modern day missions. It's unlike the days of past, but somehow, strangely, it's
Yeah.
all knitted together into God's grand narrative. So, hey, Stephanie, I'm so happy to join you on this time. I'm honored to be on the show. Thank you.
Thank you, David.